Good afternoon, world. Welcome to the campus of Bacta Griswold here in lovely Pulteney, Vermont, former home of Green Mountain College. You're here with Leo Gibson, co-founder of Bacta Spirits, and Pete Lynch, master blender. This is a product called Hogsworth. And let's start at the beginning. Tell folks what goes into Hogsworth and why we're talking about Armagnac at all. What is this product we're looking at here?
Absolutely. So this product is the result of having a lot of different stocks and a completely wide open landscape with which to play with them. This product marries together bourbon whiskey and Armagnacs in various vintage years and various proportions from various flavor profiles to create what I think is a very unique, individualistic, and frankly never before tasted spirit. Balancing out these bourbons, we made sure to pick very specific Armagnacs. The overall Armagnac input totals to 48%, so it's just about a 50-50 blend, but it's really flavor driven at the end of the day. For me, this tastes much heavier on the bourbon side. Part of that is because our 2012 input on the Armagnac side, which 11 years, feels very young to us as we've become accustomed to being,
Drinking
snob.
stuff from 1888,
exactly, yeah.
right?
Fully for us, though. That 2012 Armagnac input was actually finished in brand new toasted 400-liter Armagnac casks. 400-liter being twice the size of a regular American barrel.
Yeah.
These casks would have been used for eau de vie, new fill Armagnac. What they do is they provide a lot of body to that Armagnac input, a lot of aromatics as well, but they do so in a way that is reminiscent of a lot of the craft whiskeys we've been seeing. There will be familiar flavors, especially on the nose, that really steer this towards whiskey, but not in a way you've experienced before.
Yeah.
Now that's further tamped up by the 2010 Armagnac, about 20-21% of the overall blend there. That is a very fruit-forward, very vibrant Armagnac. Younger Armagnacs are going to tend to be very fruit-forward, very distillate-forward, but the character is still very much there.
For those who are new to things, what is bourbon whiskey for the uninitiated?
Of course, bourbon whiskey is the spirit of America. It's a whiskey distilled with a majority 51% corn or more mash bill, meaning the grain content. It is then following a few more laws, such as aging in new charred oak. In the United States, it can eventually make its way to other lands. But by and large, you will only ever see bourbon whiskey coming out of America, otherwise it will not be bourbon whiskey. And it's likely the vast majority of whiskey that most people have tasted in their life.
It's the dominant American, at least, whiskey category.
Exactly.
That's available.
It's the Rockefeller of whiskey.
Pete, how much of a cocktail guy are you?
Depends. I'd say pretty high.
So, in a sense, what we're dealing with here is the beginnings of a split base, right?
Effectively, you could say that, yeah.
And I personally, I'm not a huge cocktail guy. I tend to like the stuff that comes out of the bottle. I like to drink it neat. But some of the best cocktails I've ever had are split-based brandy whiskey cocktails.
Right, and I think that shows in the bottle itself as well, because when you have a split-based cocktail, you're gonna get more influence across the spectrum of flavor than you would obviously with just one input, and it may actually help to elevate the specific flavor of those two inputs.
Just for those who aren't familiar, a split-based cocktail would refer to a cocktail in which you're not using just one basic component, like with a Manhattan, where you're making it with a rye or a bourbon or an old-fashioned with a whiskey. There are a number of cocktails that call for two bases, right? The whiskey is one of your bases, but you may use a brandy as well.
Right.
You may use, some other form of spirit as, like a Suffering Bastard's one of my favorites right now, especially in the summer with a, gin based with and you can make it with brandy or whiskey, or with our stuff, you can make it with both. But Sazerac, Avucare, there are a number of cocktails that call for the use of both whiskey and brandy as the basis, right? There's different amazing spirits in the world. And until probably the mid 80s, the purist would tell you, well, you just want to pull that stuff off the still, and you want to stick it into a relatively neutral barrel, and you want to let it age out, and there you go. Bob's your uncle, that's what you're going to drink, and you're going to like it. But the world changed beginning sort of in the mid 80s.
Right.
Can you tell us, Pete, a little bit about the evolution? First, how did spirits end up going in the barrel, and what does that do to a spirit? Secondly, how did people begin playing around with what we'll call maybe secondary cask finishing, where you take a barrel that formerly held some different form of wine or spirit or beer, and you take, say, a whiskey that was aged in a relatively neutral container and finish it in that cask like we were talking about with the Boss Hog. And then I think we're sort of on the cusp of a new revolution in spirits here, where rather than trying to impart that flavor through a finishing cask, why not just cut out the middleman, right?
Leo,
And
buckle
blend.
up. You've
right.
bit off more than you can chew,
So
I
Pete,
think.
well, enlighten us, please.
So we've actually graduated to the point where we're potentially as an industry using barrels that have held anything, non-spirit types. I look at Dickel's Tabasco finish, shockingly well done. I even look at Fischke, which was a joke whiskey finished in barrels that held herring, done out of Sweden or somewhere like that. But that story is not so alien to the world of barrels, because why did we start using barrels originally? It's simple. It was convenient. Barrels are an archaic technology which quite literally cannot be improved upon, or we haven't figured out how quite yet, and they would have been used to store everything from water to whiskey,
or nails.
or fish.
Yeah.
And let's say, we're living on the frontier in America. Barrels are not a cheap commodity. We've just put a load of carp we brought to market in this barrel. We've dumped it out. We want to reuse this. We happen to be distillers, as farmers oftentimes are, to maintain their extra grain stores. We know it's going to taste like fish if we put it in that barrel. What's the great equalizer, the ultimate nullifier? It's fire.
Yeah.
So we decide to fire up this barrel quite literally and blast the inside, a pseudo char, if you will. And it just so happens that, the neighbors next door, they like this a lot more than the last whiskey. And it makes its way downstream. And suddenly, Pete and Leo's whiskey's getting talked about. Nice darker color on it too, never hurts, does it? Word gets around, how did they do this? Oh, charred the barrel, if you will. And granted, these people had no idea that charring or toasting a barrel is going to convert these flavors in the wood significantly from potentially negative green wood flavors, astringent tannic flavors, into quite positive wood sugar forward, aromatic, deep caramels and vanillins. But as time goes on, we perfect these arts, if you will.
So we start with barrel aging, and then we go to charred barrel aging. Right? And we discover that this process, well, first just letting the spirit rest allows some of the more volatile, harsher compounds to bleed off, in addition to pulling in some of the good notes from the wood. And then we discover that, wow, those good notes get better, like anything, when you've got a little caramelization on it.
There you go,
like
precisely.
with a baked good. And then, well, we discover, well, why don't we take it one step further, and rather than just aging it in a charred barrel, I really like the way port tastes. I really like the way sherry tastes. I really like the way Madeira Sauterne tastes. How about instead of just, finishing this in a relatively neutral charred wood container, we try to introduce some of those notes from one of those other spirits that I like into my whiskey.
This experimentation in our industry with things like cask finishing, with things like different spirit types coming out, becoming more popular, even something like a riff on gin or a sotol or mezcal even, I think has opened up the door for the end-level consumer, the one who's actually drinking the product, to say, we do enjoy this, we want this, and we are more willing than you think to accept your strange, interesting experiments.
A lot of what we're trying to do here at Bacta Spirits with sort of our whiskey-forward products is to steer folks to Armagnac, to introduce them to Armagnac, to use either cask finishes or blends as a way to open people's eyes to exactly how exquisite, rare, wonderful, ancient, deeply aged these old Armagnacs are. And, it's sort of, in a sense, the way in which we're trying to do it is either through cask finishes, taking a rye whiskey or a bourbon and finishing it in an Armagnac cask, or through blends.
Right.
Taking Armagnac as one of your bases and adding some rye or some bourbon or some other sort of whiskey to it. Because in a sense, that's how you learned about Armagnac way before I did, but that's how I discovered Armagnac. It actually does tie back to the Black Prince, the Boss Hog 4, when we took an Armagnac cask, I think before anyone else in the world did, and finished a rye whiskey in it.
Right.
I think one of my hopes for this product, one is, I think it's an amazing spirit in its own right. 2, I think it's going to make an amazing cocktail. I haven't played around
At
with it yet, but
93.8 proof, it really holds up in any format. I would
yeah,
say.
it'll stand up. 3, I think just from a packaging standpoint, it's going to pop on the shelves. I was walking through one of my local big box liquor stores not too long ago, and you stare at the shelf and it's just gotten boring.
Yeah.
You know, everybody's label has
Yeah.
got sort of the same old-timey, drab.
You almost don't notice new brands because they look so similar and familiar, don't they?
Right, and you know, there's a lot of people making some good spirit right now, but we wanted to stand out with this. So we've got, you know, pigs on the label. Raj has got a long-standing love of pigs. He's the only man I've ever known who's kept pigs as pets in his house where they sleep in his bed.
I wouldn't recommend it, by the way.
But to get a couple of great bourbons like this in the blend, paired with some of the greatest younger, relatively young for Armagnac, but still ancient, speaking in whiskey terms, Armagnacs that we have in the cellar, with this sort of proof, this sort of cocktail ability, this sort of sip ability.
Cocktail ability.
Yeah.
We're patenting that one right there.
I don't know,
Yep.
Pete. I think you got your hands on another winner here.
I agree, Leo. I think
Yeah.
we have our hands on our winner.
Cheers,
And I'll
my
cheers
friend.
to that.
Yep, congratulations.
Get your Hogsworth.
Yep, get your old Hogsworth.